Annabelle. How about Nova? Nova Crow. Thank you, sir. Sinyal?
Here.
Marcus Howard. Quentin.
Here.
Logan. All right, well. So today is the last lecture we're going to do for the material that's going to be on the test next week. And the way this is going to work is just like I did with my world history group. We'll come in next Tuesday in this room. I'll see who's here and who's missing for the test. And then we're going to go to one of the labs and take the test electronically on the computer. Go ahead and get that over with. And then that's it for that day. We'll just leave after the test. It shouldn't take longer than an hour and a half tops, but you'll have the whole period to do it if you need to. And so there won't actually be any class next week as far as lectures and stuff. It'll just be come for the test. If you're out and you cannot be here next Tuesday or you missed the test, let me know. I'll arrange it where you can take it at another time or a day. Probably in the computer, in the testing room. They just have to have the names of who, and if I give you a certain time to take it, that window, you'll have to take it within whatever we decide is best to do that. If you can't be here at all, something really comes up, then we may have to make other arrangements. But just plan on taking it next Tuesday and getting it over with. The study guide has been updated, so if you haven't had a chance to look at the new study guide for this test, in the new textbook, the one we just started using, it covers 2 through 5. You probably noticed that on the old one it said 1 through 3 or 2 and 3. That was out of the old book. It's the same material basically, it's just that the new book goes a chapter further. So today, we're going to do chapters 4 and 5 together, because in the old book, that was just one big long chapter. In the new book, it split it into 2 for some reason. That's fine to do it that way. But, so because the new book split it, the 2 chapters over the 1, I'd say the test got a little bit longer, but not a lot longer, just by a few questions. But what you see on that study guide is everything that's going to be on there. There's not going to be any surprises. You're not going to get to take the test next week and it be, oh my God, we didn't talk about any of this stuff. I promise. If you have any questions about that before next week, please let me know. And if there's anything I just don't get to today that you need to check on before the test next week, please let me know. All right, I think the last thing we talked about, we talked a lot of social history about who the Americans were, the American people were as colonists. We covered the Salem witch trials. We covered the incidents of colonial unrest before the Revolution. Now we're somewhere in chapter 4 in the new book, which this will be the last thing from chapter 4 first, and this will finish off chapter 4, and then all that's left is 5. So I really don't have that much left in 4 to cover. But if you're wondering where in the heck we are, we're going to start with the French-Indian War. And this will be the last thing in chapter 4, and then everything after that will be the last chapter for this test, chapter 5. By the way, one other thing to point out, I posted an update on there. There's not a new quiz for this week or next. I don't want to give a quiz the same week as the test, right? You already got a test next week, so there's not a quiz. Quiz 3 is the last quiz for this test, because that used to go with the old chapter 3, right, out of the old book. I kept the quizzes the same because they're open note. And I extended chapter 3, or quiz 3, until Friday. I know the deadline is already passed, but I reopened it until Friday. Just if anybody haven't taken it, FYI. Also, The Module 4 discussion, which was also due, I extended that until Friday. So if you didn't get a chance to do Module 4 discussion or Quiz 3, you've now got till Friday on that. You're welcome. The only thing for next week is the test and Module discussion 5. That's it for next week. There's no quiz for next week. All right. And don't worry about that essay either. A few people have been asking me about the essay, and I know it says it on the syllabus, and I mentioned this last time, but I'm just going to go ahead and say it again. The paper is not this week, and it's not going to be next week. The paper is going to be 2 weeks from today. It's going to be like October the 1st, really the last week of September. And that's because I want to lecture on it first before. So don't worry about what the due date says on there. The first essay on Washington's command with the fog roll, 2 weeks on that, okay? Let's just focus on finishing this for this test. All right, the French and Indian War. Not going to spend a whole lot of time about this, 1754 to 1763. Sometimes it's called the 7 Years' War. And you'll see from the dates that that is more than 7 years. That's because most of the fighting was done a couple of years before the peace treaty was signed. And the peace treaty is really what I want to focus on here, because the French and Indian War is primarily between France and England, and what's at stake is North America. So it's no secret at this point that the English pretty much fought with everybody, right? I mean, they got into conflicts with the Dutch and all these different powers. At one point, just about everybody will have to fight a war or two with England. It's not because of the colonies of North America as why France and England fought each other, but that's going to be one of the pickups from this war. Really, if you look at it, the French and Indian War is almost kind of like the first Great World War, because it really took place over most of the world. There was fighting in Europe. There was fighting in the other places, in the Caribbean, and in Southwest Asia. Anywhere that there were French forces or French colonies or French interest and British, they fought all over the world. And if you think about all the colonies and allies that those two had, it really almost was a world war, because we were involved in it, and we were fighting for Britain because the 13 colonies were British, and so we're going to help our mother country fight their enemy, which is France, right? At one point, Spain will even get involved, but they just sort of jump in toward the end. And they don't really care who wins. They don't like the French or the Spanish, or the French or the English. They're rivals, but they're opportunists, right? So the French and Indian War, this is going to be a game changer in North America, okay? The war started in the frontier of Canada and New York and Pennsylvania, right along the Great Lakes, with a fort called Fort Duquesne. It looks like Duquesne, but it's Duquesne, it's French. And the guy that was captured at this battle was George Washington, who at the time was a young colonel from Virginia working for the British. His mission was to go up there and spy on this French fort and come back with intelligence about the readout of it. And he was supposed to be undercover. They disguised him as a land surveyor. They gave him and some troops. They weren't allowed to carry weapons. They had to carry surveying equipment and stuff. And the French caught him in the wilderness and in the upper Ohio River Valley, and they took them back to this fort, and they interrogated them. And they released them. They did not execute them, because that would have been very interesting if they'd have killed George Washington during the first year of the French and Indian War, who would have led us, 20 years later in the American Revolution. So George Washington is captured in really what is the first major engagement of the war. And from there, I'm not going to get in, you don't have to know any battles of the French and Indian War. I mean, seriously, the reason it's called the French and Indian War is because both sides will use Indians to help them fight each other. Of all the groups from Europe, the group that was probably the most tolerant of Native Americans were the French, because the French saw Indians as more like equals. They saw them as trading partners. They were very involved with them in the fur trade up in Canada. And so when the war broke out, France had more Indian tribes allied with them to help them fight the American colonies and the British than the British and we did. We had some Indian allies helping us fight the French, but they had way more Indians helping them fight us. I mean, come on, if you're a Native American, wouldn't you just love an opportunity to tee off against the Pilgrims? Right? I mean, so England and France are the two most powerful countries in the world at the time, militarily, and they literally throw everything they've got into this conflict, which is why it's almost like a world war, and it doesn't just last a year or two. This thing drags on for years. Eventually, the English will prevail. They will invade Canada, with our help, by the way, and they will take over Montreal and Quebec and the Great Lakes, and all of New France falls to America and England. Using American soldiers, using British soldiers, using Native American tribes, they were able to defeat the French after really 5 or 6 years of heavy fighting. And the fighting in North America was brutal. The fighting in the French and Indian War, both sides committed atrocities. Both sides killed civilians. Both sides burned cities. Both sides, it was a horrible war. It really was. The French and Indian War set the tone for years to come. When it was over, there has to be a peace treaty, okay? And so I need you to know the terms of the Peace of Paris, 1763. Don't confuse it with another Peace of Paris. There's been lots of Peaces of Paris. Every time a conflict gets resolved internationally, it seems like Paris is the city that they always want to hold the peace conference, right? I mean, there's a Peace of Paris 1783, which ends the American Revolution. There's one in 1898, which ends the Spanish-American War. This is the city that, this city has been fought over many, many times before, and it seems like it's always the capital that gets picked. This is Napoleon, So anyway.
Speaking of, wasn't the French and Indian War that helped bankrupt the French monarchy?
Yeah, this is what's going to begin there. Yes, it was a combination of the Versailles Palace expenditures, this bankrupt France, this demoralized them. Losing this war is what's going to help inspire the French Revolution. So absolutely, this thing had huge global consequences. This was not just a local war between France and England. All right, term number 1. France lost all North American colonies. They lose everything. They lose Canada, New France, Louisiana. Here's a Jeopardy question for you. Does anybody know the only piece of land in the New World that they were allowed to keep until the 19th century under Napoleon? The only place that France was still able to, and they'll lose it in 1803.
The Louisiana Territory.
Haiti. The island of Haiti, which is really not even the whole island. It's a half island. It shares it with the Dominican Republic, which is the Spanish side of the island. That's why I still speak French in Haiti today. There'll be a slave uprising there in 1801 when Napoleon's on the throne. He'll try to go take it back. He will lose tons of men. and calls off the invasion and lets Haiti get its independence, which might have something to do with later why he doesn't want to reclaim his North American empire and why he sells it all off to Thomas Jefferson in 1883.
Isn't Haiti of strategic importance?
It's a base in the Caribbean. It's an island, and it's a toehold into the New World. I mean, other than that, no, it's not. The real prize here was Canada. Canada goes to Britain, as well as East Louisiana, which was New France, and British West Florida. All right, let me break down all this territory here. Clearly, you know Canada, right? East Louisiana is what was called New France. This is everything east of the Mississippi River up to the Great Lakes to the Appalachian Mountains. So I'm just going to throw some states out there, and this is where I'm talking about. Ohio, Kentucky, Indiana, Illinois, Tennessee, Alabama, Mississippi. You don't have to know all those states, but those are the territories we're talking about when I say East Louisiana. It's basically everything from the eastern side of the Mississippi River to the Appalachian Mountains. It's us, it's here, it's East Tennessee, all of Tennessee. That was part of what they picked up. West Florida, that's what we call the Panhandle today. That's what's getting hit by Hurricane Sally right now. This is Pensacola. This is Fort Walton Beach. This is Destin. This was Mobile.
Panama City.
Panama City. All of that was British West Florida. They're going to pick that up too. Really, it's everything from New Orleans over to the Panhandle of Florida. That's what was called Old British West Florida. If you go down there today, you'll see markers and stuff that say Old British West Florida. That's what that's referring to. All right, number 3, Spain keeps East Florida and West Louisiana. So Spain doesn't really pick up anything here, but they don't lose anything either. And like I said, they were an opportunist. They wanted to see who was going to win the war before they jumped in on that side, and when it became clear that Britain was going to beat France, they allied with Britain at the last minute, but they're just fighting to maintain what they already had. They don't want to lose the rest of Florida, because Britain could have taken the rest of Florida away if they'd have wanted it. They probably could have asked for the rest of Louisiana on the west side of the river. But because Spain backed the winner, they're rewarded by getting to hold on to New Spain for a few decades longer. Don't worry, we'll take it from the rest of them later. But what is East Florida? That's the rest of Florida. That's the non-panhandle of Florida. That's everything from Tallahassee and Jacksonville down to Miami. Okay? West Louisiana is everything on the western side of the Mississippi River. They did pick up a little bit because this was also formerly part of New France. So Spain didn't totally get nothing in this deal. Look at what they pick up. They get to pick up parts of Louisiana, parts of Arkansas, parts of Missouri, parts of Iowa. Okay? That's not a bad consolation prize. They just add that to New Spain, which was from Texas all the way over to California. They just add that to their bigger North American empire, but they don't lose anything in the deal, right? Britain could have kept that if they'd really wanted to. What Britain really wanted in this deal was Canada and New Orleans. They wanted the Mississippi River. And they now had New Orleans all the way up to Canada in control of the Mississippi River, which that's really the key to North America is the Mississippi, or was the Mississippi River. But number 4 is the big thing. Number 4 is the real biggie. The land that used to be East Louisiana, Britain, even though they pick it up, Britain creates a new Indian territory and establishes the proclamation line. Remember the proclamation line. It's a boundary. It's a line on a map that basically runs all the way down the Appalachian Mountains. So, look at my lovely map right here. Here's the 13 colonies. Here's the Appalachian Mountains. Here's the Great Lakes. Here's the Mississippi River. All right. All this in here, Tennessee, Kentucky, Alabama, Mississippi, all of this becomes the Indian Territory. And that line, they drew it right down here, and they told us, don't cross this line. Don't cross the proclamation line. Don't go west of the Appalachian Mountains. Because what we wanted to do was not have these states, but make all of this New York, all the way to the Mississippi River. Not have a Tennessee, but add all that to the Carolinas. Not have a Georgia stop where Georgia does, but have Georgia go all the way to New Orleans. It could have happened. It didn't happen because Britain said, don't cross the boundary. All this land between the Mississippi and the Appalachians, this is now the Indian territories. We're going to take all the Eastern Indian tribes that we have driven off the East Coast, and we're going to resettle them here, and this is going to be their colony, basically. We get Canada. Britain keeps Canada. You can have your 13 colonies. Here's Spanish Florida. This is Indian territory. We want to reward them for helping us win the war. We also want to cut down on colonial excursions, because what was happening is settlers were leading people over the mountains and illegally settling in parts of East Tennessee, through the Cumberland Gap, Kentucky, and they were causing fights with Indian tribes that were already living there. And Britain was trying to separate us by saying, okay, we've already given y'all the 13 colonies and you've driven all those Indians out. Let them stay over on one side of the mountain, y'all stay on the other side of the mountain. And that way, we don't have to intervene in any more conflicts or wars here. And it was a way to reward them for helping beat the French. It's not that Britain loved rewarding the Indians, it's just that they were trying a legal solution, if you will, to address a sort of a catch-all of a lot of different issues going on. It doesn't work.
If that would have been, if that location would have been moved, or that would have been part of the initial agreement, would it still have been enough of a factor to cause revolution?
It's not the only factor that caused a revolution, but it is the big factor. So the essay option you're going to have in the test next week, everybody's writing the same essay, Causes of the American Revolution. This ought to be front and center, because we felt slighted. We felt cheated. We helped the British fight and won their big war against France, and we thought all this should be ours. We thought it belonged to us, but it wasn't ours to give and take in the first place. Now, was it? But tell that to a Virginia or a New Yorker, or, they wanted to keep expanding across the mountains. They wanted to go all the way to the Mississippi River. And Britain said, nope, you're big enough. We want you on the East Coast where we can keep y'all in check. They're also trying to keep us in check. If these original 13 colonies expand into all this new real estate, we become a big country at that point. We will double the size or even triple the size of the United States. We might become a rival to Britain. That's what they were really worried about. So this was done for a lot of reasons. It was done to keep us in check. It was done to keep conflicts between us and Indians down, so Britain wouldn't have to intervene. It was done to reward the Indians for helping them fight. Okay? It was done as a barrier between the British and the Spanish, sort of a frontier. Okay? We really resented this. We felt like we should have had the right to cross over this proclamation line and settle this territory. And we began to do so illegally. And sure enough, it led to a lot of conflicts between Native American tribes that had been promised this land. And they could speak English. They learned the treaties and said, wait a minute, you're violating the terms. And white settlers from the 13 colonies just kept coming in and started killing each other. And Britain was like, we did this for your own good. It's like separating two children, right? But we didn't want to be taught to that way. We didn't want to be treated that way, did we? So, even though the French and Indian War itself was not a direct cause of the revolution, this proclamation line definitely was. This was a big sticking point between the American colonists and England. Are there any questions about the French and Indian War or the terms of the Peace of Paris, 1763? Y'all could never hope to draw such a beautiful map on your own. I know you're impressed. I'm going to leave this up here because it's just too impressive to erase. I'm going to erase all that. I'm going to leave this for the next group. Whatever night class is in here, they're going to just have to
Remember,
they're gonna have to deal with it.
remember the posters that were here last semester?
We found all kind of weird stuff in this room
Yeah.
last semester. What did we find in here?
Posters, the door stops kept disappearing.
Yeah, it was.
Has that stopped?
It's always fun the stuff you find left over. There were some weird papers in here, weren't there?
And there was.
I can't remember what all.
Apparently Hitler was no nonsense.
Apparently so. They probably said the same thing after we left. So we are now on to our final and last chapter now, chapter 5. This lecture is being recorded. This will go up there as 4/5, just like the other one was 3/4, because again, 2 chapters in the old book, or 2 chapters in the new book, 1 chapter in the new book. That might be a good place to stop it for editing purpose and restart it. You want to do that?
Yep.
So it won't be one big file to have to break